Hey, I'm Doug Beaumont. Welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to talk to you about the subject of my new book, The Message Behind the Movie. The Message Behind the Movie from Ignatius Press is actually a reboot of this book, which was the first one that I ever wrote. This was published by Moody Press back in 2009. So this is the updated version of this. The reason for this reboot is that a number of things have changed over the years. For one thing, I became Catholic. I also received my PhD in theology. I have had 3 more kids, and I wanted to update some of the ideas, examples, and even include some new material in this new book. I've added some new arguments for the existence of God, added a small section on the problem of evil, a discussion of the historic church, and I also included a full movie interpretation and evaluation in the end. So there is quite a bit more to this book than there was in the original. But what about the idea of the message behind the movie itself? Some people are uncomfortable with the idea that movies convey messages, that, they're just for entertainment, it's not really that important, they don't have that much effect on people. Well, that is, I think, demonstrably false. For one thing, people don't pay the kind of money that they pay to get into the movie theater or run some kind of streaming service if they are not being affected by something. If we were not being strongly affected by movies, we wouldn't be shelling out money to watch them. Moreover, companies are spending millions, if not billions of dollars a year just for short product placement ads in a movie. These ad companies are experts at getting things into our minds so that we remember them, and if they didn't think that the movies were not influencing us, those millions and billions of dollars would go somewhere else. So I think it's kind of naive to think that we are not being affected by movies. The difference is whether or not we notice it and whether or not we take an active role in assessing that influence versus just passively sitting by and letting it happen to us. My contention is that all good stories contain some kind of message. Now, it's not always completely obvious and on the surface what the message of a story is, and if it's a good story, it won't be. Typically, people don't like to be given spoon-fed messages when the message of the movie is obvious and the story is kind of pushing you to think a certain way. We call that propaganda. That's not good art, that doesn't make for good entertainment, and it doesn't make a good movie. Usually, if a movie has a message, it is embedded in certain objective features of the film that actually communicate that message rather subtly. So for example, we might have a very direct message about saving the environment in a movie like Day After Tomorrow, whereas we have a very similar yet more subtle indirect message in the movie WALL-E. However, just because a message is more subtle or indirect doesn't mean that there isn't an objective way to see what that message is. Now, although movies have a variety of methods for getting their message across, one of the most standard ones is in the story itself. It's embedded in the story structure. It's a classical structure that goes all the way back to Aristotle. Now, what Aristotle said about classic story structure is that all stories have a beginning, middle, and an end. Now, that may not seem terribly insightful, but of course there is more to it than that. Now, having a beginning, middle, and end doesn't just mean having a first, second, and third sentence. If I said something like, "Hey, I went to the store," you would probably wonder where I was going with that. And if I said, "Well, I went to a store, but they didn't have the candy bar I wanted," you would probably still wonder why I was beginning this story if I had nowhere to go with it. But if I said, "You know what, I went to the store the other day and they didn't have the kind of candy bar I wanted, so I bought a new kind and it turned out I liked it even better." Okay, now we actually have a story. There's a point to the words that I'm saying. And when it comes to movies, it's kind of the same way. There's what we call Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. And in each of those acts, certain things happen to certain characters, and that is the conveyor of the message of the story. So Act 1 is basically just the beginning of the story. It's the once upon a time. In this part, we are establishing context and characters. So the context is basically the world of the story. Is this a real-life kind of story that obeys the laws of the real world, or is this some kind of made-up world? Now, it's important to note that just because something is not historically accurate or true, that doesn't mean that the story can't tell a true message. So there's a difference between fiction and falsehood. Fiction is when we tell a story that didn't actually happen. A falsehood is when we basically lie about the way things really are. So for example, Jesus often taught in parables, stories that didn't necessarily actually happen in history, but that had a moral, they had a point to them. It's like fairy tales and other kinds of stories. We read novels, we see movies, we hear a lot of stories that teach us things about the world, even when they're not using the real world to teach them. So in Act 1, we're going to see what the world is like, and we're also going to be introduced to the main characters. This is when we're going to meet the protagonist. The protagonist is the character that we're going to follow through the story and see what ultimately happens to them. We might also meet the antagonist. This is usually a character, but sometimes it can be something else that is getting in the way of what the protagonist wants. And so the interplay between the protagonist and the antagonist is really going to drive the story. Notice that an antagonist is not always a character or a villain. In the story that I gave about the candy bar, the very fact that the store was out of a candy bar became my antagonist, even though there wasn't necessarily any character involved. So Act 1 is really about establishing the world of the story and the characters in it that we're going to want to keep an eye on. Now at some point, usually about 20 or 30 minutes in a standard length movie, we're going to run into some confrontation. Something is going to happen that is going to disrupt the protagonist's life. There's going to be some goal that they can't reach, and this is going to cause a conflict. And this moves us into Act 2. Now, Act 2 is going to last from the initial challenge of the conflict all the way up to its crisis point, the point of no return, where it's absolutely got to be dealt with. Act 2 is usually the longest part of the story. It's usually the longest part of the movie. Sometimes it's nearly all of the rest of the movie after Act 1. So the confrontation is going to begin with some kind of challenge to the protagonist. It's usually going to multiply and get worse and worse and worse and more difficult until it reaches the crisis point. This is where the protagonist absolutely has to deal with finality with this conflict. And it's at the crisis point that we enter into Act 3. We are now headed straight into the climax of the story. We're going to find out what finally happens to the protagonist. How do they deal with that conflict? Now, in classic story structure, the Act 3 move from the crisis to the climax is what lets us know whether this story is going to be a comedy or a tragedy. Now, in classic story structure, comedy doesn't necessarily mean funny, and tragedy doesn't necessarily mean sad. That's really more of an emotional response. Rather, what it's referring to is what happens to the protagonist based on how they deal with the confrontation. I'm calling this the resolution. If the protagonist acts in a certain way, overcomes the confrontation, and when they reach the climax of the film is benefited by their actions, that's considered a comedy. In other words, it's a positive outcome for the protagonist. If, however, the protagonist acts in such a way toward the confrontation that between the crisis and the climax they are harmed or destroyed, that is what's called a tragedy. It is at this point that we can start to see the message behind the movie. Whether it's a comedy or tragedy, we are being told something about the world. If you act in this way toward this kind of confrontation, good things happen or bad things happen. The second half of the message behind the movie goes into some of the messages that Hollywood is sending out and helps Christians deal with some of the more important messages that they might encounter. Messages that have to do with what faith is, the nature of truth and reality, whether or not God exists, what is the church. And not only does the book discuss those messages and how to reply to them, but it also shows how to use movies as a springboard for getting into these kinds of conversations in a more natural way. All right, thank you for watching. This channel is all about Christian theology, philosophy, and apologetics. If you've enjoyed it, I hope you'll give it a like, subscribe, click that bell if you want to know when new videos come out. Until next time, I am Doug Beaumont. Thank you for watching, and God bless.